He remembered the nights in tents that smelled of horse sweat and stale bread, the breath of cold wind pressing through loose flaps, and the memory of snow-laden branches under moonlight. He remembered the soft hush of men's voices, anticipating battle come dawn, and the disquiet that had plagued every soldier and camp follower alike during those uncertain months. But in this turning of history, Robb Stark's heart remained hardened not in betrayal but in rightful determination, and Walder Frey, cold and crafty though he was, chose not to snap the trap shut. The Red Wedding, as men would have called it, was never orchestrated by the sullen patriarch of House Frey and the cunning masterminds from the south. The union at the Twins was sealed in good faith. Nothing more. Though it was no pleasant feast, there was no massacre lurking in the rafters, no last-second wail of the rains of Castamere, no knives glinting in candlelight. The candles burned low, the toasts were half-hearted, and there was a sense of unease clinging to the corners of the ancient hall. But all who stepped inside managed to step out again alive and unbloodied. In this alternate turn of events, each figure left with a different sense of relief. The northern host departed Walder Frey's domain with guarded expressions, uncertain whether they had narrowly escaped a danger they failed to recognize, or if the danger itself had simply been a paranoid imagining. Yet Lord Walder's suspicious gaze followed them as they filed from his halls and crossed the old stone bridge. He was no less bitter, no less offended by past insults, but something in him or around him stayed his hand. Perhaps it was a last-minute persuasion, whispered by one of his many sons or grandsons eager for mercy or favorable prospects in the new order. Perhaps it was the rumor of another threat at his doorstep, or a shift in the broader war that demanded his caution. Or perhaps, beneath the layers of grudge and cunning, even Walder Frey felt some twinge of decency. Robb Stark, the young wolf, did not rejoice too openly. Where Walder Frey's greed or grudging sense of honor ended, the resentment of the Lannisters began, and Robb's victory depended on forging alliances among the fractious lords of the Riverlands. Moreover, in this version of events, Robb was still reeling from the knowledge that he had broken his pact with House Frey by marrying Talisa, or Jane Westerling, as some told the tale differently, something that had required a new arrangement with Walder Frey. The new arrangement was not struck lightly, nor was it sealed with genuine warmth. It was sealed as so many alliances were, through gold, promise of titles, promises of advantageous matches for various Frey children. None of it left Robb feeling entirely at ease. He felt as if he had scaled a precarious wall at night. A single misstep, and he would slip into a black abyss. Still, the crossing was accomplished without bloodshed, and that alone was cause for some measure of relief. Catelyn Stark felt that relief most profoundly. She had pressed her son to seek peace and maintain allies at all costs. She had known the precariousness of trust in men like Walder Frey, where courtesy was as thin as the ice over a swift-running river. And if it held, if only just barely, she was grateful. Her doubts lingered, perhaps more severe than Robb's, for she was older and more attuned to the fault lines in men's dispositions. But it was better than the slaughter she had feared. She had dreaded a wedding feast drenched in blood, a retribution that spelled the end of House Stark. She had heard the stories in her nightmares, though she could not explain why they haunted her so vividly. Now, stepping from the Twins, she dared to let herself believe in the possibility that the North might endure, that her family might remain safe for a little while longer. The bitterness on both sides left a sour aftertaste. Even though Frey men lined the battlements with cold suspicion, even though the solemn faces of the northern bannermen reflected the tension that nearly turned lethal, the columns marched on. The steel-tipped pikes and the banners of the dire wolf rippled above them. The unstoppable tide of northern indignation continued, forging southward into the Riverlands or perhaps turning again to face the iron ranks of the Lannisters and their allies. The broad question that lingered among lords and small folk alike was simple. Now that Robb Stark still lived, and now that he had not been betrayed at the Twins, what next? Word spread rapidly throughout the Seven Kingdoms that the wedding had gone smoothly, or as smoothly as it ever would have under Walder Frey's roof. There had been no bloodshed, no betrayal. Ravens carried the news to King's Landing, to Dragonstone, even beyond the narrow sea. Lords who had anticipated a swift end to Robb Stark's rebellion, lords who had readied themselves to pledge fealty to the Lannisters, began to question what turn the war might now take. In the war's earliest days, Robb Stark had seemed unstoppable, capturing Jaime Lannister and winning key victories. Then came the blow of losing Winterfell, the capture of Theon Greyjoy, the loss of his younger brothers, the betrayal by Roose Bolton in the north. Yet each of these setbacks had not spelled final defeat. This was another turning point. Now, with Walder Frey's support, however grudging, it seemed the young wolf was as dangerous as ever. North of the Neck, Roose Bolton, Warden of the North in the false courtesy of the Iron Throne's pronouncement, sensed a shift in the winds. He had once believed that Robb Stark's downfall was inevitable, that it was only a matter of time before treachery or sheer force ended the young wolf's cause. But this curious new event forced him to reevaluate. If Walder Frey had not turned cloak to slaughter the northern host at the Twins, might Walder Frey's loyalty to the Iron Throne be less stable than the Lannisters believed? Would House Bolton's betrayal thus remain unexposed? And if it became exposed, what shape would the new conflict take? Roose was not one to panic, but he was one to anticipate every eventuality. He began to rework his network of alliances, to confirm each secret letter with Tywin Lannister, because the cost of being on the losing side would be his life. Bolton was cunning, pragmatic, and merciless. The shifting alliances meant he needed to walk more carefully than ever. Further south, Tywin Lannister received the tidings in King's Landing with calm composure. His mind was a labyrinth of strategies, and he never let his disappointment show. The plan had been to orchestrate a betrayal through the Freys. He had nudged them, promised them, bribed them, or threatened them in private. But apparently, something had gone awry, and Walder Frey had balked at the last moment. Tywin had not pinned all of his hopes on the Freys alone, but it would have been an elegant solution to the war. Now, with Robb Stark's forces intact, Tywin had to consider that the war might grind on. He summoned his council, weighed the matter carefully, and sent out new orders to the Freys, the Boltons, and any others who might be persuaded to bring the Stark rebellion to an untimely end. Within the city walls of King's Landing, Queen Cersei's eyes narrowed when she heard that the Northerners had escaped what could have been a cunning blow. She thought of Joffrey, her son, who was still sitting the Iron Throne, though restlessly and cruelly. She also thought of her brother Jaime, still a prisoner of the Starks somewhere in the Riverlands. She demanded news, pressing Pycelle for ravens and Qyburn for rumors. Had Jaime been harmed or bartered, or used as some weapon to bring the Lannisters to their knees? So far, the news was uncertain. The Queen was restless, pacing the corridors, urging her father to orchestrate some savage solution. But Tywin was not one to be rushed. He allowed her no illusions. The war would be won through cunning and perseverance, not impatience. Amid the swirling conspiracies of King's Landing, Tyrion Lannister listened to the developments and recognized at once the precariousness of it all. He had no personal interest in seeing more slaughter, but he also understood that as long as Robb Stark lived, the realm remained at war. More men would die, more fields would be burned. Still, Tyrion, who had once witnessed Robb's cunning on the battlefield, wondered if this spared wedding might be the seed of something else. Perhaps an eventual treaty, or perhaps more bloodshed down the line. He didn't know. He only knew that the game had changed yet again. Meanwhile, at the Twins, Walder Frey's own brood was divided. Some whispered that the old man had lost his nerve, that he had grown feeble in his advanced age, missing his chance to extract revenge for the slight against his daughter. Others insisted that he was merely biding his time, waiting for the right moment. Walder himself said little, snapping commands to the many Freys who served as his stewards and guards. When pressed, he would mutter that the young wolf had made amends, that there was no immediate profit in vengeance. But his watery eyes told another story. He was not content, and he would never truly forget the slight. For now, though, the wedding had ended as a wedding should, leaving Robb Stark with a living bride instead of a funeral pyre. So the northern host continued its slow march through the Riverlands, forging along narrow roads turned to mud by spring rains, crossing half-smashed bridges, and skirmishing with stray Lannister patrols. The men were tired from months of war, but their morale lifted somewhat, for they had survived what many of them had whispered would be the end of it all. At night, they built fires, sang old songs of the North, and told their wives or sweethearts in letters that they were still alive, still soldiering on in the name of House Stark. Robb Stark rode at the head of the column, flanked by Grey Wind loping at his side. The dire wolf was a silent shadow in the gloom, neither trusting nor hating the men around him, but ever alert to any potential threat. Robb stroked the beast's fur occasionally, feeling that primal sense of connection. He had lost so much: his father, his home, his brothers, but Grey Wind was a part of him. They shared some intangible bond that gave Robb strength. Behind them rode a handful of key northern lords: Galbart Glover, Rickard Karstark, still nursing his own bitterness over his son's deaths at Jaime Lannister's hands, the great Jon Umber, and others. Catelyn Stark traveled with them, somewhat behind, her expression unreadable as she tried to keep her hope from turning to fear again. Talisa, or Jane, depending on the version told, rode in a small litter or on horseback, depending on the day's weather and her comfort. She was Robb's wife in name, though her presence at the wedding had been subdued and overshadowed by the tensions. Still, she clung to the vow they had made, trusting that Robb's sense of honor and her love for him would see them through. She knew little of the politics swirling around them, but she could feel the tension in every conversation, sense the men's uncertain gazes. She tried to nurse the wounded as they continued their slow march, doing what she could to prove that she was not just another piece in the game. That devotion won her a few friends among the common soldiers, but the lords remained wary. Day by day, the army advanced deeper into the Riverlands. They found burned villages and fields reduced to ash, courtesy of either Lannister forces or the reckless pillaging that accompanied an army's passage. Deserters and bandits prowled the woods. The northern outriders often clashed with these brigands, leaving corpses strewn in the ditches. Robb insisted on order and discipline, not wanting his men to become the same sort of ravagers who had laid waste to so many parts of the realm. But the bitterness of war took its toll, and more than once, he had to hang a deserter or punish a soldier for cruelty to local peasants. It was a grim business, but necessary if he hoped to maintain loyalty and moral authority. At Riverrun, Edmure Tully and Brynden Blackfish Tully awaited word of Robb's safe arrival. Word had already flown ahead that the Red Wedding had not happened, which caused Edmure to sigh in enormous relief. He had feared for his nephew and for the entire cause. Riverrun stood as the last bastion of Tully power in the Riverlands, ringed by Lannister forces from the west and Frey forces to the east, though the Freys were nominally allies once again. The Blackfish, ever vigilant, had refused to put too much trust in Frey loyalty, and so Riverrun remained on high alert. When at last Robb's banners appeared on the horizon, shimmering in the afternoon sun, the gates opened and a gathering of Tully men ushered them in. The reunion was marked by hugs, tears, and anxious questions. Catelyn embraced her brother Edmure, though her eyes were already scanning the ramparts, looking for any sign of new trouble. Robb clung to a stoic front, greeting each loyal bannerman by name, offering words of reassurance. He declared that soon they would press the advantage, that the cause was not lost. The men cheered, though softly. There were too many dead, too many uncertain fates. The castle's yard filled with the bustle of stabling horses, restocking supplies, and seeing to the wounded. Inside the hall, Robb convened a war council, calling upon the lords to deliberate their next move. In that dimly lit chamber, tapestries parted by the mild breeze, the air heavy with the scent of old stones, Robb mapped out his plan. They would gather their strength at Riverrun, consolidate the river lords who remained loyal, and attempt to open up a corridor to the north. The question was whether or not they could reclaim the neck and break the siege that the Ironborn had placed upon Moat Cailin. The Greyjoy rebellion in the north had weakened the Stark hold on their homeland, but word had it that Balon Greyjoy was dead and that his brother, Euron, had taken the Seastone chair. The Ironborn might not be as single-minded in their northern incursion. Perhaps that provided an opening. Yet even as these discussions progressed, ravens arrived from Walder Frey, from Tywin Lannister, from other corners of the realm. Each raven bore some new demand, threat, or enticement. The realm was a patchwork of alliances, and the lines of loyalty shifted like dunes in the desert. Tywin's message was curt. Surrender the Kingslayer, bow the knee to King Joffrey, and receive terms. Walder Frey's was half a rant about promised marriages, half a demand for more tangible rewards. Others from the Vale, from the Stormlands, word from Stannis Baratheon on Dragonstone, who had not been idle. The war had fractured into many fronts, and none could see the entire board. But if there was one thing Robb Stark possessed, it was the resilience of the North. He refused to yield, not after what had befallen his father and after so many had already perished in his cause. Moreover, Jaime Lannister was still his prisoner. That remained the greatest bargaining chip, though it also made him a target for every sellsword and assassin seeking Lannister gold. Catelyn felt uneasy whenever she saw the Kingslayer patrolling the courtyard under guard. She remembered how she had once considered freeing him in exchange for her daughters. Arya and Sansa were still in the Wind, or in King's Landing, or wherever fate had taken them. Some said that Sansa was betrothed to Joffrey, others that she was forced to wed Tyrion. Rumors swirled. As for Arya, no one seemed to know. She was a ghost in the chaos, and Catelyn could only hope she was alive. Jaime Lannister was a restless captive, leaning against the rampart walls, gazing at the red waters of the river, stroking the stub of his severed hand if one followed the show's continuity or the timeline of the books with slight differences. Each day he tried to provoke the guards, to talk his way into being freed. But the guards had their orders. Jaime sometimes demanded to speak with Robb, to propose a prisoner exchange. Robb refused to grant him an audience except on the rare occasion a strategic question arose. Jaime's presence was a reminder of everything the North was fighting against, and yet, ironically, everything that might secure them victory if used properly. Days turned into weeks. Riverrun became the nexus of strategy, with outriders departing daily, ravens flying overhead at dawn and dusk, carrying coded letters and alliances. The strain on the castle's resources grew, but Edmure managed to keep the supply lines open. Farmers loyal to the Tallis brought grains, orchard fruits, and salted fish from the surrounding countryside. The men-at-arms drilled relentlessly, preparing for the next battle. The Great John was eager to march, roiling with unspent energy, but Robb needed to plan carefully. He could not simply charge headlong into the Lannister lines as he had done early in the war. The tides had changed. Tywin was wise to his tactics, and the realm was no longer dazzled by the unstoppable young wolf. In the privacy of her chamber, Catelyn sometimes collapsed into tears, longing for the simpler times when her children were young, their futures bright. She thought of Bran and Rickon, rumored dead in the sacking of Winterfell. She thought of Sansa, a prisoner in King's Landing, living under the Lannisters' thumb. She thought of Arya, gods knew where, but then she would wipe her tears, remembering her duty. She had to stand at Robb's side, to be the voice of caution and reason, to ensure that the North's cause did not shatter under the weight of vengeance. She knew that they were one stroke of misfortune away from seeing it all fall apart. Eventually, word came that Tywin Lannister had redeployed some of his forces, possibly to reinforce the Freys or to move against Stannis on the Blackwater Bay. No one could be certain. Spies brought scraps of information. King's Landing was rife with rumors that Margaery Tyrell was soon to wed King Joffrey, sealing an alliance between the Lannisters and the Tyrells. Stannis Baratheon was said to be nursing his losses on Dragonstone, but was rumored to be planning something. Perhaps he was forging deals with pirates or looking to the north for support. The entire realm was a tinderbox. One pale morning, Robb decided that the time had come to strike at the Lannisters in the west, to break their hold on the Riverlands for good. He laid out the plan for his bannermen in the Great Hall, the candlelight flickering over the rough-hewn map spread on the table. They would move westward, cross the Red Fork, and try to draw the Lannisters out into open battle near the remnants of a once verdant farmland. If they could secure a decisive victory, it might force Tywin to negotiate. Alternatively, if Tywin refused to take the bait, they could push deeper, threaten his supply lines, and potentially encircle Harrenhal or other strongholds. It was a gamble, but all war was. Catelyn was fearful. The last great gamble had cost them dearly when they had marched south. But Robb insisted that the time for caution was slipping away. Each day gave the Lannisters more time to replenish their ranks, and if the Tyrells fully allied with King's Landing, the North would be hopelessly outmatched. The lords discussed it, weighed the options, and in the end, most agreed that they must attempt something bold. The Freys, ostensibly still their allies, would remain at the Twins, but Robb decided not to rely too heavily on them. He did, however, request they send a token force to join him, a demonstration of good faith. Walder Frey grudgingly complied, sending a few hundred men under the command of one of his many sons. A fortnight later, the northern host departed Riverrun again, leaving behind a small garrison to protect the castle. The roads west were less destroyed than those to the south, but the signs of war were everywhere: burned farmhouses, half-eaten crops in the fields where starving peasants had gleaned what they could. Occasionally, they came upon small clusters of refugees who gazed at the direwolf banners with a mixture of hope and fear. Robb's men offered them what little food they could spare, sending them to Riverrun for shelter if they were well enough to travel. At times, disheveled men in battered armor emerged, claiming to be loyal to the Tullis or the Starks, seeking to join the host. They were welcomed cautiously, made to swear loyalty again, then assigned to lesser duties until they proved themselves. The deeper they marched into the western Riverlands, the more they encountered Lannister outriders. Skirmishes erupted in the forests, with small pockets of riders clashing in the undergrowth. The Great John reveled in these fights, leading his men with boisterous war cries, but Robb insisted on discipline and unity. He did not want a prolonged guerrilla conflict. His aim was to provoke the Lannister field army into facing him. If they refused, he would press on, burning the Lannister-held farmland, though he took no pleasure in it. Every torch set to a barn weighed on him, but he saw no other way to break Tywin's hold. War demanded cruelty, or so the lords told him. At least cruelty of a limited, strategic kind, he reasoned. He tried to spare the small folk whenever possible. Word eventually reached Tywin that the young wolf was threatening the western supply lines, and Tywin answered by sending a sizable force under the command of Ser Gregor Clegane and the newly formed alliances with the local lords still loyal to the Lannisters. Ser Gregor the Mountain was a terrifying presence, known for his brutal tactics. Villages emptied ahead of him as people fled, for the Mountain's reputation for pillage and slaughter was unmatched. But while Gregor was fearsome, he was not a cunning tactician. Tywin would likely join him soon, if the situation demanded it. Robb's scouts brought news that the Lannister force was only a few days' march away, near a region where the Tumblestone River curved in a wide loop, flanked by rolling hills. Robb examined the terrain, hoping to find a place that could serve as a strategic trap. He remembered the lessons from his first victories, how he had outsmarted the enemy by using the land to his advantage. He consulted the Blackfish who had ridden with him. The older knight pointed out that the hills could be used to stage an ambush if they played it right. But the Lannisters knew some of those tricks by now. The armies converged near an expanse of farmland dotted with low stone walls and a few half-burned cottages. The sky was overcast, threatening rain but not quite delivering it. Robb formed his host into two main divisions, one commanded by himself, the other by the Great John. Rickard Karstark's men formed the left flank, silent and grim. The Frey contingent, numbering only a few hundred, positioned themselves at the rear. Robb wanted them far from the main line, in case Walder Frey's loyalty wavered at the critical moment. Catelyn watched from a rise, flanked by a small guard, her face pale but resolute. On the opposing side, the Lannister banners appeared in ominous waves of crimson and gold. Gregor Clegane's men rode near the center, their armor tarnished and battered. They were a savage bunch, rumored to have sacked half a dozen villages on their march. Aside from Gregor's men, there were also other loyalists from the Westerlands, led by lesser-known knights hungry for Tywin's favor. The atmosphere crackled with tension as the two forces arrayed themselves, the banners snapping in the wind. Robb breathed in, recalling every crucial moment that had led him here. His father's execution, his own proclamation as king in the north, the heartbreak of losing Winterfell, the precarious alliance at the Twins. Everything had funneled into this single confrontation. He urged his horse forward, Grey Wind pacing alongside. The lines of men, thousands on both sides, stretched out across the fields. Some small folk still hid in the area, possibly in the crumbled cellars of old farmsteads, hoping to survive the impending carnage. At a sharp cry from a horn, the battle began. Arrows whistled through the air, darkening the sky for a heartbeat. Shields lifted, men shouted, and the lines surged forward. Robb led the vanguard personally, his sword glinting in the gray light, shouting for the north. The clash was deafening. Metal on metal, horses screaming, men cursing or crying out as they fell. The ground quickly became slick with mud and blood. Each yard gained or lost was contested with savage intensity. Gregor Clegane was at the thick of it, a monstrous figure swinging a massive sword that cleaved through men as though they were straw. Robb's men struggled to contain him, but the mountain cut a path of carnage. Arrows pelted his armor, but it was thick and he pressed on. Near him, lesser knights roared out the name of House Lannister, driving forward. Ricard Karstark's riders clashed with them, seeking revenge for the sons Karstark had lost. The shrieking of horses mingled with the war cries. Through the chaos, Robb tried to maintain command, rallying units that faltered, directing archers to focus on key areas, urging the flanking force under the Great John to encircle the Lannisters. Smoke billowed from a burning cottage, obscuring part of the field. He prayed that the Great John wouldn't let his fury override strategy. There, in the swirling dust and smoke, was a chance to collapse on the Lannister flank. If it succeeded, they might break the enemy's lines. If it failed, they might be encircled themselves. Little by little, the lines shifted. Men slipped in the mud, grappling hand to hand. Shouts of "The North remembers" rose amid the clangor. Robb glimpsed gray wind darting in, dragging a Lannister soldier to the ground, fangs bared. Somewhere behind the lines, Catelyn watched, her heart pounding as she tried to see if her son was still alive amid the roil of swords. The Fry men hovered uncertainly, some urging their commander to either charge in or hold back. Robb had stationed them near the baggage train, both to protect supplies and to keep them out of the main fray. Then came the sound of more horns. Distantly, on the horizon, a new banner emerged, gold on green. At first, many men feared the worst. Was Tywin Lannister arriving with more reinforcements? But that was no lion banner. This was the sigil of House Tyrell. The cavalry that arrived cut into the flank of Gregor Clegane's men with savage efficiency. The confusion was enormous. One moment, the Lannisters believed they were about to break the northern lines. The next, they were beset by a fresh force on their flank. Men shouted, "Tyrells!" and others gasped, asking if it was the Reach riding to aid the north. But the Tyrell banners, bright as spring, gave no immediate answer. Ser Brynden Tully, leading a small scouting party, had apparently reached out to the Tyrells in secret, forging an alliance of convenience. Or perhaps it was some cunning scheme of Olenna Tyrell, the Queen of Thorns, who disliked the Lannisters and saw advantage in aiding the Starks. Robb himself had not fully anticipated this, though he knew some negotiations had occurred. Whatever the cause, the Tyrell riders tore into the unprepared Lannisters, further shattering their formation. Seeing opportunity, Robb roared for his men to charge once more. The Great John, bellowing with uncontained glee, led a wedge of northern cavalry that slammed into the center of the Lannister line. The line buckled, men falling beneath the hooves. Gregor Clegane, unstoppable though he seemed, was briefly isolated. Karstark knights pressed in around him, hacking at his sides. For a moment, he looked as if he might be overwhelmed. But the mountain was a nightmare in the flesh. Even surrounded, he swung his massive blade, cutting down 2 men at once. Another spear jabbed through his side, but he only roared and kept fighting. The men who tried to take him down realized that they would likely die in the attempt. Eventually, a group of Tyrell knights joined in, distracting him while Karstark's men stabbed at the seams in his armor. The last that Robb saw was Gregor, bellowing in pain and fury as blood poured down his leg. Whether he lived or died in that moment was unclear, but he was no longer leading the Lannister men. The Lannister host began to break. Without Gregor's leadership and faced with a combined assault of Northerners and Tyrells, their lines collapsed. Pockets of Lannister loyalists tried to rally, but more of them turned to flee. The Tyrell cavalry gave chase, cutting them down in retreat. The battlefield was a scene of mud, blood, and corpses scattered among smoldering debris. Robb's men, exhausted and battered, raised ragged cheers. They had won, and it felt like a victory the entire realm would hear of. When the dust settled, Robb rode slowly across the field, gray wind at his side. He saw men trying to tend to the wounded, searching for survivors. Many of his own bannermen lay among the dead, but for each of theirs, a handful of Lannisters had fallen. It was a costly but decisive triumph. As he surveyed the battered Tyrell riders approaching, he dismounted. One knight, removing a plumed helm, revealed himself to be Ser Garland Tyrell, brother of Loras Tyrell, both loyal sons of Mace Tyrell. He saluted Robb with surprising respect. Robb returned the gesture. It was an awkward moment, for these houses had never been close, but in war alliances could form abruptly. Ser Garland explained, in short, that the Tyrells were not wholeheartedly in bed with the Lannisters. Marjorie's betrothal to Joffrey was a political move that the Queen of Thorns engineered to keep the Tyrells' options open. However, they had no love for Tywin or the lion's share of power the Lannisters held. If the Tyrells could keep the Lannisters off balance by aiding the Starks here and there, and position themselves advantageously for whatever came next, they would do so. Robb listened cautiously, thankful for their aid but not entirely trusting. Still, he recognized that a wedge had been driven between the Lannisters and their most important allies. He invited Ser Garland and his men to speak more at a parley once the day's fighting was fully settled. Amid the scattered remains of the Lannister camp, they found some valuable prizes: food, horses, weapons, and the tattered banners of the Lion. The prisoners, many of them wounded, were gathered under guard. Robb issued orders for them to be treated fairly, though he would hold them for ransom. Among them were a few knights of lesser Lannister vassal houses, each of them cursing their misfortune. The northern soldiers, still stinging from earlier defeats, glared at them with cold fury but obeyed Robb's commands. There would be no pointless slaughter of captives. As the sun descended, painting the sky with streaks of crimson, Catelyn emerged from her vantage point, relief and exhaustion etched into her features. She hurried to Robb, embracing him tightly, ignoring the mud and blood that stained his armor. He assured her that he was unhurt, though many of his men had paid the price. They both knew that the cost of war was borne by so many families, Stark included. But for this night, at least House Stark had a reprieve. The Red Wedding had never come to pass, and they still stood, defying the Lannister might. That evening, they set up a makeshift camp. The Great John and other lords gathered around fires to swap tales of the battle, praising the valor of their men and exchanging bits of news with the Tyrell knights who had joined them. There was a wary camaraderie in the air, for no one was entirely sure what the alliance with the Tyrells would entail. But men were tired, hungry, and glad to be alive, so for once, they allowed themselves a little cheer. Robb found a quiet spot by a small, battered apple tree, where Talisa or Jane waited with bandages and herbs. She fussed over a small cut on his arm, worried it might become infected. He smiled at her concern, pulling her close. Though the war was far from over, he felt a sense of triumph and hope that had eluded him for a long while. They spoke softly, acknowledging the uncertain future, but cherishing the moment. If the gods were kind, perhaps this victory would mark a turning point in the war. Come morning, the gruesome task of dealing with the dead began. The smell of decay hung in the air. Burial details from both sides carried bodies to mass graves. There was little time or space for dignified rites, though officers and knights were often granted separate pyres or shallow plots marked with their sigils. Robb joined in some of the prayers, remembering that the men who fought for him were not nameless. They were men of the North, men with families waiting at home. He felt the weight of it on his shoulders. The cheers of victory no longer rang so loudly when confronted with the price. Within a day, the lords convened a war council. Ser Garland Tyrell joined them, representing his father, Mace Tyrell, as well as Olenna Tyrell's cunning interests. It was an odd assembly, Northmen wearing thick cloaks and Tyrell knights in brighter, floral crests. Yet they spoke civilly enough. The Tyrells informed Robb that King's Landing was not as stable as it appeared. Joffrey's engagement to Margaery might secure the city's food supply, but it did not guarantee Tyrell loyalty. If Robb could force the Lannisters into a more desperate position, the Tyrells might consider openly siding with House Stark or at least forging a neutrality that favored the North's independence. Catelyn was skeptical, suspecting that the Tyrells were playing both sides. She asked Ser Garland what the Tyrells truly wanted. He gave her a polished, vague answer about ensuring the prosperity of the Reach and seeing a just resolution to the war. But neither Catelyn nor Robb fully believed that. Nonetheless, they recognized that the Tyrell cavalry had saved them from a much bloodier confrontation. For the time being, the Tyrells were allies or, at worst, a faction that could be used against the Lannisters. After some negotiation, it was decided that a more formal discussion would be held at Riverrun or another neutral location to determine the terms of an alliance. Ser Garland's forces would remain in the area, coordinating with Robb's until that parley happened. Meanwhile, across the realm, word of the battle spread like wildfire. The young wolf rises again. The whispers went, telling of how Robb Stark had not only escaped the bloody fate of the Red Wedding, but had also crushed a Lannister force led by the Mountain with unexpected Tyrell support. Many small folk took it as a sign that the Lannisters' hold on the Iron Throne was weakening. Others were more cautious, pointing out that Tywin Lannister was still very much alive, commanding the largest army in the Seven Kingdoms, and that King's Landing still boasted formidable walls. Yet a new spark of hope kindled in those who had once believed the North's rebellion was doomed. In King's Landing, Tywin contained his fury behind a mask of iron composure. The news that Ser Gregor's force had been routed and that the Tyrell cavalry had assisted Robb Stark arrived in quick succession. Tywin realized at once that the Tyrell alliance might be fracturing. He summoned Mace Tyrell to explain, but Mace professed ignorance, claiming he had not authorized any aggression against the Lannisters. Tywin did not entirely believe him. Cersei raged that the Tyrells were treacherous, calling for Margaery's immediate arrest, but Joffrey was besotted with the idea of a new bride. Tywin had to maneuver carefully. He could not afford to lose the Tyrells' main support, which provided the city with food and additional troops. He penned letters, made threats, and considered how best to remedy the situation. If Mace Tyrell publicly disavowed Garland's actions and reaffirmed loyalty to the crown, that might suffice. But if not, war on a second front could become a reality. For the moment, Tywin had no direct way to strike back at Robb except through bribing the Freys or the Boltons to deliver the Starks a fatal blow. But the non-Red Wedding had shaken Walder Frey's appetite for betrayals, at least in a direct sense, and the Boltons were carefully concealing their intentions. Roose Bolton sent polite, measured responses that gave away nothing. The dynamic was altogether different from the timeline where the Freys and Boltons had conspired at the Twins to end Robb's cause in one savage feast. Back in the north, the scattered remains of Winterfell lay in ruin, its walls partially collapsed, its great keep blackened by fire. The Ironborn who had held it were gone, driven out or killed by Ramsay Snow in the original continuity, though here the details might shift. If the Red Wedding never happened, perhaps the opportunistic brutality of Ramsay was not as fully unleashed. Yet, the new Warden of the North, installed by Tywin Lannister on paper, was Roose Bolton, but his hold was tenuous. Wildlings threatened from beyond the wall, though no one in the south cared to note. The peasant folk of the north were scattered, some clinging to hidden crofts, others forging small resistances. News of Robb's victory in the west gave them a flicker of hope. Perhaps their true king in the north would return and reclaim his homeland. Days turned to weeks once again. Robb led his battered but determined host back to Riverrun, accompanied by Ser Garland Tyrell and a modest retinue. They arrived to fanfare and relief, for word of their victory had preceded them. The Tully banners flew proudly from the ramparts. Catelyn oversaw the welcome, ensuring that the Tyrell knights were provided decent quarters and that their presence did not offend the local lords. Edmure Tully, feeling somewhat overshadowed by his nephew's success, made the best of it, greeting them warmly while the Blackfish remained vigilant. A great feast was organized to celebrate the victory, albeit a modest one compared to the lavish banquets of King's Landing. The men sang songs of the young wolf, of the direwolf's fury, and of the Tyrell cavalry that arrived in the nick of time. Amid the revelry, Robb and Ser Garland held quiet negotiations in a corner of the Great Hall. They exchanged cautious words about the possibility of attacking King's Landing together or forcing Tywin Lannister to the negotiation table. Robb made it clear that his primary goal was northern independence and the safe release of his sisters. Ser Garland insisted that any formal alliance would require Mace Tyrell's approval. His father could not be so easily swayed if the Lannisters still offered lucrative marriage pacts or other boons. However, Garland believed his grandmother, the Queen of Thorns, might push for supporting the Starks if it gained the Tyrells a stronger position in the post-war order. The conversation ended with no firm agreement, but a sense that the door was open. Outside the Great Hall, in the castle corridors lit by torches, Jaime Lannister paced as best he could under guard. He overheard fragments of talk about the battle, about the Tyrell intervention. His mouth twisted in sardonic amusement at the idea of the Tyrells siding with the Starks. If Tyrion were here, Jaime mused, he'd spin some elaborate speech about the ironies of power. Jaime sometimes attempted to talk with the guards, but they had strict orders to keep him silent and confined. On rare occasions, he glimpsed Catelyn or Robb passing by, each time giving him a curt nod but no real courtesy. Jaime was a valuable prisoner, and he knew that if he tried to escape, he would have an arrow in his back. So he waited, quietly seething, his pride stung by captivity. Meanwhile, in the Spartan quarters set aside for her, Talisa continued tending to the wounded. She saw men with missing limbs, men with fevers that threatened to sweep through the army. She was tireless, a small beacon of compassion amid the grim realities. The common soldiers began to speak of her kindly, calling her the Wolf Queen, even though no official crowning had taken place. To them, she was a sign that Robb Stark had a caring partner by his side. Not all the northern lords were enamored with her. Some still grumbled about the broken Frey betrothal, but for the moment, her presence seemed to improve morale. As the days in Riverrun wore on, ravens flew in and out. One arrived bearing the seal of the Eyrie, from Lisa Arryn, Catelyn's sister. It was a terse letter, offering neither help nor hostility. Simply news that the Vale remained closed to outsiders, refusing to commit to the conflict beyond its borders. Another raven carried a message from an anonymous source in King's Landing, warning that Joffrey's wedding to Margaery Tyrell would take place soon. If the Tyrells here in Riverrun did not hurry back or show some sign of loyalty, they might be declared traitors. The tensions mounted. Robb knew he had to act soon, or watch the Tyrell forces slip away. A parley was arranged in a neutral field by the Red Fork between Robb, Ser Garland, and a representative from Tywin Lannister, none other than Kevan Lannister, Tywin's brother. The day was sunny, the water sparkling under the midday light. Each party arrived with a small escort, heavily armed but kept at a distance. Kevan Lannister, a more moderate voice than Tywin or Cersei, spoke carefully, offering terms that included the release of Jaime and recognition of Robb as Warden of the North, but not King, provided Robb knelt to Joffrey and renounced all claims to independence. Robb refused, stating that the North's blood had been shed in vast amounts already. They would not bend the knee to a king who had executed Ned Stark and threatened his children. Ser Garland observed these talks, interjecting occasionally, trying to glean whether a compromise was possible. Kevan attempted to sweeten the pot by implying that Sansa Stark would be returned to her family. But the details were vague, and the conversation grew tense. Robb insisted that both Sansa and Arya be returned. Kevan claimed ignorance of Arya's whereabouts. The parley ended with no agreement, only the acknowledgement that each side would send further messages. In the following weeks, Robb's alliance with Ser Garland's contingent grew somewhat strained. The Tyrell knights grew restless, worried about the consequences of being labeled traitors by their own father and by King's Landing. Rumors suggested that Margaery's wedding was imminent. Garland received an urgent raven, presumably from Olenna, telling him to tread carefully. Eventually, Garland informed Robb that he and his men had to depart for Highgarden to address pressing matters. He offered vague promises of future cooperation, but no guarantees. With that, the Tyrell contingent rode away, leaving the Northerners to wonder if they had only been used as pawns in a larger Tyrell scheme. Despite that loss, Robb retained confidence. He had won a major victory, inflicted losses on the Lannisters, and proven that House Stark was far from finished. The Riverlands were largely under his control again, except for certain enclaves like Harrenhal, held by a shifting array of forces, and the Freys at the Twins, officially allies, but never fully trusted. He possessed Jaime Lannister as a hostage, and could potentially trade him if the terms were right. Perhaps, with careful negotiation, he could secure the release of Sansa, or even find out more about Arya. And so the war continued, with the lines not nearly as clear-cut as they would have been if Walder Frey had unleashed the massacre that history once whispered about. Instead of the Red Wedding, the realm witnessed a clash of armies in the western Riverlands, the unexpected Tyrell intervention, and a precarious web of alliances that might break or bend at any moment. Months slipped by. Word reached Robb that Stannis Baratheon, defiant on Dragonstone, had made some move northward. Some said he was sailing for the Wall to confront the wildling threat. This news puzzled Robb. If the Night's Watch was truly in peril, did that not concern all the realms of men? But the iron grip of war refused to let logic prevail. Tywin Lannister still commanded the largest armies, though he had not dealt a fatal blow to the north. Joffrey's wedding to Margaery Tyrell took place in lavish splendor at King's Landing. Tales of the event, which included a grand feast and dwarfs jousting in mockery of various houses, seeped out into the realm. For a moment, it appeared that the Tyrells were indeed fully aligned with the Lannisters once more. Robb felt betrayed, though not surprised. Then came the shocking news that King Joffrey had died at his own wedding feast, choking on wine. Some said it was poison. Whispers labeled it the Purple Wedding. Cersei blamed Tyrion, who was swiftly put on trial. The realm's leadership was thrown into disarray, with the boy King Tommen ascending. Tywin still pulled the strings, but a monarchy under Tommen might be more pliable. Some believed that with Joffrey gone, the chance for peace might grow. Others saw it as an opening to strike at a weakened crown. Robb watched these developments from Riverrun, uncertain whether to press an advantage or to seek a truce. With the Lannisters' leadership in flux, an opportunity existed. But the risk was that Tywin, enraged by the death of his grandson, would redouble his efforts to crush the North. Catelyn urged caution, reminding Robb that they still did not know Sansa's status. Perhaps Sansa had been widowed if she'd been married to Tyrion. The lines of loyalty among the great houses were more tangled than ever, especially with the Tyrells playing both sides. As the leaves turned gold and red, the war drifted into another phase, a protracted stalemate punctuated by skirmishes. The northern host tried to retake Harrenhal, but found it abandoned by the Lannister forces. A small garrison of Sellswords left behind melted away at the first sight of the direwolf banners. Robb left a token force there, but he had no intention of making it a seat. Harrenhal was a cursed place. He merely wished to deny it to the Lannisters. Meanwhile, the small folk of the Riverlands began to trickle back to their villages, encouraged by the fewer sightings of Lannister raiders. Some rebuilt their homes in the shadow of burned timbers, hoping that this time, war would not return. At Riverrun, Jaime Lannister still paced behind bars, though his accommodations had improved slightly. Robb had him guarded but not mistreated, hoping to someday use him in a high-value exchange. From time to time, Jaime petitioned for a conversation with Catelyn Stark, promising to do all he could to free her daughters if only he were released. Catelyn, torn between maternal desperation and mistrust, listened warily. Could Jaime truly influence Tywin or Cersei to let Sansa go? Or would releasing Jaime only cost them their leverage? Each day, she prayed to the Seven for guidance, for a sign. Meanwhile, Roose Bolton in the north grew uneasy. Winter was coming, slowly but inexorably, and with the realm still at war, the harvest was uncertain. If the Boltons could not secure their position, they might face rebellion from the scattered northern houses that still revered the Starks. Roose kept a tight rein on Ramsay, hoping to prevent him from committing atrocities that would incite further uprisings. A few letters from Robb reached the Dreadfort, demanding Bolton's fealty, but Bolton responded with only vague assurances. The tension there simmered, ready to boil over if the impetus arose. Far to the east, across the narrow sea, other events unfolded. Daenerys Targaryen gathering an army of freed slaves, forging her own destiny. But that was a story that had yet to intersect fully with the war in Westeros, at least in the immediate sense. For now, the fate of the Seven Kingdoms turned on the question of whether Robb Stark's rebellion would succeed or fail, and whether Tywin Lannister could maintain control of King's Landing. As autumn deepened, Robb knew that a decision loomed. He could attempt to march on King's Landing itself, capitalizing on the chaos after Joffrey's death, but that would require more alliances. The Vale was closed, Stannis was in the north, and the Tyrells had seemingly recommitted to the Lannisters despite their earlier cameo of support. The phrase remained unreliable. Even Edmure Tully, for all his loyalty, worried about the cost of a grand offensive. Winter would soon choke the roads with snow. Perhaps a negotiated settlement, returning Sansa and Arya in exchange for Jaime and the North's de facto independence, was within reach. The day came when Tywin Lannister sent a raven proposing a formal truce. He wrote that Tommen, the new king, wished for peace. He proposed that Robb maintain control of the North, albeit as a vassal, while the crown would release Sansa, confirm Robb's marriage, and perhaps even return certain prisoners. Robb felt that the terms were laced with traps, for Tywin never gave anything for free. Yet the letter suggested that if Robb refused, Tywin would be forced to redouble his offensives, and the war would extend indefinitely. Catelyn urged him to at least consider it for the sake of Sansa. The lords of the North were divided. Some believed any deal with the Lannisters was worthless. Others believed that the realm needed peace. In private, Robb agonized. He had dreamed of an independent North, free from southern entanglements. He wanted justice for Ned's execution, for all the harm the Lannisters had inflicted on his family. But his people were weary, the Riverlands were ravaged, and winter's chill was already creeping into the nights. He could press the war further, hoping for a total victory, but the cost could be catastrophic, and there was no guarantee of success. Or he could attempt a fragile peace, one that might preserve some measure of northern autonomy and save countless lives. In the end, Robb agreed to meet Tywin's representatives once more. They chose a ruin steeped in the Riverlands as a neutral site, its walls battered by the war, its stained glass windows shattered. The delegations arrived under flags of truce. Robb came with Catelyn, the Blackfish, and a cadre of northern lords. Tywin's side included Kevan Lannister, Pycelle, and a number of gold-cloaked guards. The atmosphere was tense. While crossbowmen watched from the remnants of the walls, the two sides laid out their positions. Over several hours, they hammered out the shape of a possible accord. The North would be recognized as a semi-autonomous region under the authority of King Tommen, but with the right to choose its own warden and manage its own taxes. Jaime Lannister would be returned to the crown. In exchange, Sansa Stark would be released, and her marriage to Tyrion either annulled or recognized on terms acceptable to House Stark. The details were murky. Arya Stark's whereabouts remained unknown, but the crown promised to help locate her. There were myriad other clauses, ransom amounts, exchange of prisoners who would hold which castles. Tywin sought to protect the Lannisters from future reprisals. Robb sought to ensure that the North's independence was effectively guaranteed. Nothing was signed that day. They parted with the outline of an agreement, each side suspecting the other would backstab at the first opportunity. Yet it was a step toward something other than endless bloodshed. As Robb mounted his horse to ride back to Riverrun, he glanced at Catelyn's tired face. She offered him the smallest smile of relief. Perhaps Sansa would be saved. Perhaps the North would be spared further ruin. It was not the triumphant victory he had once envisioned, but it might be survival. He remembered the feeling of dread at the twins, the sense that all could have ended in a bloodbath. But it had not. The Red Wedding never happened, and in that divergence, the war stretched on in complicated, uncertain ways. yet with a faint glimmer of hope that the Stark line would endure. And so they rode off into a realm still embroiled in the echoes of war, uncertain if the negotiated peace would hold or if the fires of vengeance would reignite. The battered Riverlands, the tense watchers on the walls of Winterfell's ruins, the suspicious lords of the Reach, and the cunning brood and kings landing all braced for the next turn of fate. The storms of winter loomed on the horizon, the White Walkers whispered of in the far north, and across the sea, dragons stirred. But at least in this moment, this fragile moment, House Stark still stood. The Red Wedding had never become a horrifying reality, and thus the great wheel of destiny spun in a new and uncharted direction, with old grudges unresolved but new paths open to those bold or lucky enough to take them. Robb Stark rose before dawn on the morning after the parley. Sleep had been elusive, haunted by the choices laid bare before him. Continue an uncertain war against a cunning and powerful Lannister regime, or attempt a compromised peace that might save lives but would leave so many wrongs unavenged. In the corridors of Riverrun, the torches guttered low, painting the stone walls in wavering shadows. Outside, a thin mist curled over the river. The sky held only the faintest hint of pink on the horizon, promising a sunrise that would be cold and hesitant. He dressed in a simple wool tunic and leather jerkin, discarding the heavier armor for the moment. Gray wind padded at his side, huge paws eerily silent on the flagstones. As Robb made his way onto the battlements, he found Catelyn Stark already there, cloaked against the chill, gazing down at the water below. She turned as he approached, offering the smallest of smiles. In the growing light, her face looked drawn with worry, new lines etched into her forehead. The cost of leadership weighed on them both. They stood together for a time, not speaking, watching the mist roll over the surface of the Red Fork. The quiet gave them a sense of privacy that was rare these days, with lords, knights, and soldiers crowding every hall and courtyard. At last, Catelyn broke the silence. "Have you considered Tywin's proposal?" Robb exhaled. The mere mention of Tywin Lannister made his heart knot with anger. "I have," he said. "Part of me wants to ride south, muster all the men we can, and strike at them before winter truly sets in. But I've seen enough death, Mother. I lost too many good men in the West, and the realm is in tatters. If the Lannisters are genuinely offering a chance at peace." She placed a hand on his arm. "You worry they might be lying?" "Of course I do. I'd be a fool not to. This has all the hallmarks of a scheme, words on parchment that promise the North some measure of autonomy, but no guarantee we'd keep it. Yet we might save Sansa." His voice caught at her name. Sansa was still a hostage in King's Landing, at least in the last official word. Perhaps a widow now after Joffrey's death, or still wed to Tyrion, or in some precarious state that none of them could fully confirm. Catelyn's eyes turned away, her sorrow palpable. "We must try," she said. "We cannot abandon her. We cannot lose another child." Robb nodded. That, more than anything, guided him forward. "We'll see how these negotiations progress. I'll not sign anything if it robs the North of its honor. We've come too far for that. But I won't close the door on them either. Not until we've talked further." They stood there a moment longer, mother and son, bonded by grief and duty. Below, the castle began to stir. Stable boys leading horses out into the yard, men-at-arms relieving the night watch. They could hear the metallic clank of chainmail in the distance, the rumble of wagon wheels on the drawbridge. The day called them back to the business of war and the precarious hope of peace. That morning, Robb convened a meeting in Riverrun's Great Hall, once the seat of House Tully's gatherings, now the strategic nerve center for the Northern Riverlands alliance. Though their numbers had diminished after the battles, enough lords remained to fill the benches and create a din of low conversation. The Great John was there, large as life, looming over the lesser knights like a bear among dogs. Lord Rickard Karstark sat with his arms folded, his expression cold. The bitterness in his eyes had never fully left him after the loss of his sons. Edmure Tully looked tense, mindful that these discussions affected his own land as much as the North. Brynden Blackfish Tully, standing near the hearth, kept his own counsel, his keen eyes flicking from speaker to speaker. Also present, though they took up less space, was the Fry contingent. A half-dozen of Walder Frey's sons and grandsons, each with watery eyes and suspicious glares, sat near the back. Robb kept them at arm's length, quite literally. Though Walder Frey had not betrayed the Starks in this alternate turn of fate, trust between House Stark and House Frey remained on uneven ground. The broken betrothal to a Frey daughter still cast a long shadow. Yet Walder Frey had sworn loyalty, or something like it, and the presence of his men here was a demonstration that House Frey, for now, remained bound to the king in the north. An air of expectation fell over the hall as Robb took his seat at the high table, with Catelyn at his right. He cleared his throat. "We have all heard news from the south," he began. "Word of King Joffrey's death, of Tommen's succession, and Tywin Lannister's new role guiding the throne. We also know that the Lannisters have open channels to us, terms of peace." Murmurs spread among the lords. Some spat onto the floor at the mention of Lannister peace. Others leaned forward in guarded hope. Robb continued, his voice carrying clearly. "Nothing is decided. I'll not accept a false truce. But I want counsel from each of you. This war has cost us dearly, and if a truce can spare us further bloodshed while respecting our rights, we should hear it out." The great Jon, never one to hold his tongue, rumbled a response. "If you ask me, the time for talk ended the day Lord Ned was beheaded. We should ride south, string up the lion whelps, and feast in their halls." A scattering of cheers erupted from some of the more belligerent knights. Robb maintained his composure. "I share your anger, Lord Umber. But let us not forget how many men we've lost already. Another march on King's Landing means crossing half the realm, fighting Tywin Lannister's main host, and possibly the Tyrells if they close ranks again. By the time we break the gates, if we break them, we'll have lost half our men. The Riverlands can't sustain another campaign without turning to ashes." Edmure Tully nodded vigorously. "My sister's right. The farmland is scorched. My lords, we're already stretched thin. Supplies for any major offensive would need to come from the north, and winter is knocking at our door." Karstark's voice cut in, low and resentful. "We have the Kingslayer under lock and key. That's our best card. We trade him for what? Sansa alone? A piece of parchment saying we can call ourselves wards of the king? That's no justice for my sons, or for the thousands butchered by the Lannisters. If we release Jaime Lannister, we lose our best leverage." Silence fell at that, and all eyes flicked to Robb. He could sense Karstark's underlying reproach. Months earlier, he had tried to keep the man's thirst for vengeance in check. He had even threatened to hold Karstark in chains if he harmed Jaime before a proper negotiation could occur. Karstark's loyalty was precarious, held by a thread of duty and fear. Robb turned his gaze to the older lord. "Your grief is mine, Lord Karstark," he said carefully. "Your losses weigh on us all. But if we want to bring Sansa home, and if we wish to avoid further slaughter, we must keep our options open. I've not made any final decision about releasing Jaime. I only say we should talk first, see what is offered." Karstark's scowl deepened, but he did not protest further in that moment. In the back, one of the Frey sons coughed. "Has the crown offered to restore certain titles to certain families who might have been slighted in the past?" he asked, eyes darting about. "Lord Walder is keen to ensure the loyalty of House Frey is recognized in the new order." Robb fought the urge to roll his eyes. Walder Frey's demands always seemed to revolve around land, titles, betrothals, and coin. They had narrowly avoided a massacre at the Twins, one that might have gone down in history as the greatest betrayal in Westeros, due to some last-minute twist of fate. Still, the tension lingered. Robb answered tersely, "Any specifics would be hammered out in negotiations, though I promise nothing to House Frey except the opportunity to present your needs to the crown if a peace is reached." The Frey man sank back, looking vaguely mollified. At length, the meeting wound down with no definitive conclusion, only a sense that they would proceed cautiously. Robb dismissed the lords, requesting that they remain at Riverrun or within close range, ready to muster should the negotiations fall through and war reignite. One by one, the men filed out, some deep in hushed conversation, others silent and grim. Catelyn lingered, as did Edmure and the Blackfish. "What's your next step?" Brynden Tully asked his nephew, folding his arms. Robb glanced down at the table, where a map of the Riverlands showed scorched fields and broken roads. "I've sent word to Tywin that I'm open to a second parley, one with more structure than the last. He'll likely send Kevin Lannister or someone similarly measured. If that goes well, we might move on to an actual summit. If it goes poorly, we'll at least know. And I'll be ready." He looked to his mother. "You should be there with me, Mother. You've negotiated such matters before. You know their ways." Catelyn nodded. "If it will bring Sansa back, I would walk into the seven hells themselves." Not long after, a raven arrived from King's Landing bearing Tywin Lannister's seal. The letter read as expected. Tywin proposed a formal meeting near the ruins of a holdfast in the southeastern Riverlands, somewhere that neither side controlled, to ensure neutrality. The letter suggested a small retinue, each side bringing only a token guard. In return for the safe conduct of the Lannister envoy, Tywin guaranteed safe passage for Robb and his chosen attendants. The language dripped with cautious politeness, but hidden barbs lay within. Tywin still demanded that Jaime Lannister be brought to the negotiations, at least so they could confirm he lived. Robb weighed the demand. Bringing Jaime to the table was risky. He remained Robb's biggest piece of leverage. But Tywin would not proceed without seeing proof that his son was alive and well. "Very well," Robb said grimly. "We bring him under heavy guard. Let Tywin see that we keep our word better than the Lannisters do." Before they departed, Robb spoke privately with Jaime in the small courtyard that now served as an exercise yard for the captive Kingslayer. Jaime stood in simple leathers, his golden hair ragged from long captivity, face leaner than it had once been, but still exuding that familiar arrogance. Grey Wind prowled nearby, hackles slightly raised. Two guards hovered with crossbows at the ready. Jaime gave Robb a wry smile. "You've come to tell me I'll be paraded in front of my father's men, I assume." Robb nodded curtly. "In so many words, yes. You'll be bound, with guards at your back, until we know we aren't walking into a trap. And if you try anything, if you so much as twitch in a way that unsettles me, my men will put a bolt through your heart." Jaime's gaze flicked to Grey Wind, then back to Robb. "I'd expect nothing less. You'd be a fool to trust me. But if you want these negotiations to succeed, you can't treat me like a beaten dog the whole time. My father doesn't respond well to humiliation." Robb's face hardened. "If your father truly wants peace, he'll understand that I have reasons to keep you closely watched. That's not humiliation. It's common sense. Anyway, what do you care? You'll be one step closer to freedom." Jaime shrugged, though he cast his eyes away. "Freedom," he repeated in a low tone. "I suppose so. As free as a man can be with one hand missing. Not that you had anything to do with that, if the rumors are right." He flexed his arm, the stump hidden beneath a leather covering. In this alternate timeline, he might have lost his sword hand differently, or perhaps not yet, but for the sake of the story's flow, it seemed he did indeed lose it somewhere along the way, maybe at the Whispering Wood or in a separate scuffle. The detail remained hazy, but the bitterness was evident. "Just don't let Rickard Karstark get too close to me. The man would love to see my head on a spike. That wouldn't help your negotiations." "We want Sansa back," Robb said, ignoring Jaime's attempt to jab at Karstark, "and an honorable peace for the North. If that means not letting Karstark butcher you, then so be it. I'll keep you alive until the moment you give me reason not to." Jaime's lips curved in a faint smile. "Honorable peace. A nice dream. Let's see how far it goes." When the day arrived for the second parley, the sky was iron gray, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. Robb set out with a small retinue. Catelyn rode beside him, her face drawn but resolute. Brynden Tully led a squad of 20 seasoned men-at-arms, and Lord Bolton's representative, one of Bolton's underlings, as Roose himself had remained in the north, joined as a silent observer. Behind them, Jaime Lannister rode on a sturdy gelding, wrists shackled, flanked on both sides by crossbowmen. He kept his head high, saying little, even when the men who escorted him spat or muttered curses. Their route took them through farmland still bearing scars of war, Burned barns, shattered fences, fields churned into mud by passing armies. A light drizzle began to fall, soaking the cloaks of the riders. But the journey remained uneventful. Brynden led them to a ruin along a shallow river. An abandoned tower half collapsed into rubble, once the seat of a minor house that had died out generations ago. A few broken walls offered partial shelter, and patches of moss clung to the stones. They arrived at midday. A Lannister banner flew from a makeshift post, red and gold, snapping in the cold wind. At the far edge of the ruin, Tywin's party had gathered. Half a dozen knights in shining armor, bearing the lion sigil. Kevan Lannister, looking stony and reserved. Pycelle, the Grand Maester, shivering beneath a heavy cloak. And, presiding over them all with austere dignity, Tywin Lannister himself. He wore heavy riding leathers with the lion embossed on the breast, a thick cloak around his shoulders. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes glinted when he spotted Jaime among Robb's party. Robb dismounted, keeping his posture tall, shoulders squared. Catelyn followed suit. Grey Wind, at Robb's side, bared his teeth in a silent warning that told the Lannisters not to try anything rash. The northern guards took up positions around their king, crossbows half lowered but ready. Tywin's gaze flicked between them all. Finally, he inclined his head in the barest courtesy. "King Robb," he greeted, emphasizing the title in a way that suggested it was not something he granted lightly. "You've brought my son as requested." Jaime was shoved forward a few steps, chains clinking. He lifted his chin defiantly. "Father," he said, voice rasping slightly. Tywin's face showed a flicker of concern before returning to that cold mask. "Are you well, Jaime?" "As well as can be under the circumstances." Jaime turned his head to indicate the shackles, a ghost of sardonic humor in his eyes. "The Starks have been gracious enough not to kill me in my sleep. Yet." A faint tension broke as Tywin extended a hand. One of his knights stepped forward, cutting off Jaime's chains with a single strike of a specialized chisel, though they left a short length around his wrists so he could not easily draw a sword. Robb allowed it, though Brynden Tully watched warily, a hand near his own blade. "Shall we talk?" Tywin said, looking at Robb once more. "I trust we can be civil." Robb nodded. "Lead on." They stepped toward the partial shelter of the old tower's remains, where a half-fallen archway shielded them from the drizzle. Guards stayed within sight, but at a respectful distance, so that Tywin and Robb could speak with some semblance of privacy. Catelyn stood at Robb's right, Kevan Lannister at Tywin's left, while Jaime hovered behind his father, flanked by Lannister men who eyed him in relief and wariness. Tywin began without preamble. "My letter proposed that the North bend the knee to King Tommen, as Warden of the North with broad autonomy. In return, Sansa Stark would be released, her marriage to Tyrion annulled if you wish. My son has little interest in keeping an unwilling bride, especially now that Joffrey is gone. The crown would then recognize you as Lord Paramount of the North and the Trident, a formal merging of the Stark and Tully dominions." He paused. "We also require the return of my son, Jaime." Robb studied him, measuring every word. "And what of my father's murder? Of the men you slaughtered in the Riverlands? Or the lives lost when you sent your raiders to burn our fields?" He felt his anger rise. "Are we to forget that as we kneel before your boy king?" Tywin's gaze held steady. "War is a bloody affair. Many atrocities have been committed by both sides. You burned Lannister-held farms, killed loyal men of the Westerlands. Your father was executed on the orders of King Joffrey, an act I did not personally endorse, though I won't deny I benefited from it." Catelyn bristled, but she held her tongue as Robb spoke again. "This is precisely why I doubt your so-called generosity. You talk of broad autonomy, but I've seen how the crown deals with threats. If we lay down arms, how long before a Lannister host marches on Winterfell the moment it's convenient?" Kevan interjected, his tone measured. "King Tommen does not desire further bloodshed. The North is vast, and we see little profit in trying to rule it directly. Recognizing your governance spares the realm from an endless war. You would pay taxes to the crown, of course, but you'd be free to handle your own lords. The phrase, Boltons, and others would answer to you. Robb's jaw tightened. And Sansa is returned to me safely? Tywin nodded. Yes, though you must know the girl's whereabouts have changed somewhat. Since Joffrey's unfortunate death, she has not been seen in King's Landing. I believe she fled or was taken by Littlefinger. But we do have resources searching for her. The moment she is located, she'll be brought safely to the north, if we have a peace agreement. Otherwise, she remains a valuable piece. A swirl of alarm tightened in Robb's gut. Sansa missing? That complicated everything. He glanced at his mother, whose lips parted slightly in dismay. You said you would return her. If we had her, we would, Tywin said, unruffled. We assume she's either with Peter Baelish, perhaps on her way to the Vale, or hiding somewhere in the city. I do not lie to you. Cersei was furious when the girl vanished. We suspect Baelish orchestrated the escape. But if we reach an accord, we'll dedicate the crown's full resources to retrieving her alive and unharmed. Robb's teeth clenched. The possibility that Sansa was wandering the realm, alone or in the hands of schemers like Baelish, weighed heavily on him. But he forced himself to remain calm. This is not encouraging. Yet, I'll not turn away from the hope of rescuing my sister. Tywin's expression remained impassive. As for Arya Stark, we've heard nothing. We suspect she might be dead or lost. If she reappears, we'll see that she's delivered to you as well, under a peace treaty. Catelyn's eyes flashed. My daughter might still live, and you speak as though you're doing us a favor in returning a child you should never have taken in the first place. Tywin spread his hands in a small, dismissive gesture. As I said, war is full of horrors. You took my son captive. I sought to hold your family members. That is the game, Lady Stark. If you want them back, let us have peace. Robb took a steadying breath. Very well. Acknowledging the difficulty in guaranteeing Sansa's return. If you sign a pledge that you will use all your resources to find her and return her to me, if you confirm the North's autonomy with no Lannister interference, then perhaps we can find common ground. But Jaime? He will not be freed until I have something more concrete than promises. Jaime's jaw tightened, but Tywin waved a dismissive hand at him. He'll remain a hostage, to be released when you have Sansa. Understandable, but I demand that you keep him under comfortable conditions. No dungeons, no shackles, full courtesy as befits his station. Robb glanced at his mother. She gave a subtle nod. Fine, Robb said. He shall remain under guard at Riverrun, well treated, until my sister is safely returned to me. A hush fell. The drizzle pattered on the mossy stones. Tywin studied Robb's face. It seems we have an outline of an agreement then. Lord Kevin will handle the details. If you hold up your end, you can keep your crown in the north, if you insist on calling yourself king, though formally you'll be recognized in King Tommen's court as Warden of the North. It's a meaningless distinction to me whether you style yourself king, so long as the taxes flow and there is no further rebellion. Robb stiffened. That is not exactly the recognition we want, but let's see the final language first. His father had died for the principle that the North would be free of southern tyranny. Yet if the realm could be spared more carnage, perhaps accepting a nominal tie to the Iron Throne, in exchange for near-total self-rule, was the best they could achieve. We will finalize the details at a formal summit. Tywin nodded curtly, turning to Jaime. You'll go back with them, my son, for now, but rest assured we'll see you free soon. Jaime said nothing, though he met his father's eyes with a mix of relief and resentment. If there was any warmth left in their relationship, it was buried under layers of pride and bitterness. After a few more pointed exchanges, the parties withdrew, each side suspicious but forced to trust the other enough not to unleash immediate violence. Robb's retinue escorted Jaime back to their horses. The tension in the air was palpable. A single misstep, a crossbow discharged by accident, a soldier's sword drawn in anger, could have reignited the war on that very spot. But the moment passed. By dusk, the northern riders were heading back toward Riverrun, having taken the first real step toward a truce since the war began. Word of the parley spread quickly, sowing confusion and cautious optimism alike. Lords in the Riverlands wondered if peace truly was at hand, or if it was some devil's bargain orchestrated by Tywin Lannister. Some of the more hardened warriors swore they would never bend the knee to the Iron Throne, not after so much blood had been spilled. Others, worn down by the unrelenting horrors of war, yearned for any respite. They had lost farms, family, fortunes. If a negotiation could end the cycle of slaughter, they supported it. In the north, the news reached lords from White Harbor to Deepwood Motte. Many were torn. The dream of a free and independent north had been a rallying cry, but the reality of a draining war tested their resolve. White Harbor, under House Manderly, had always maintained mercantile ties with the south. If the war continued, famine might descend, ships might cease trade, and winter could become truly catastrophic. Others, like the Mormonts on Bear Island, found themselves short on men, their resources stretched thin from constant mustering. Even loyal families had to question whether a formal arrangement with King's Landing, on Stark-friendly terms, might be wise. One man who watched all of this with sharp, pale eyes was Roose Bolton, the nominal warden of the North under the Lannisters' previous decree. He had consolidated power from the Dreadfort, claiming loyalty to both King's Landing and, by extension, to Tywin. But that was before Tywin had extended the olive branch to Robb Stark. Now Bolton's position was uncertain. He had once believed he could play both sides, declare for the Starks while secretly aligning with the Lannisters or vice versa. But if Tywin and Robb came to terms, there would be no advantage in Bolton's duplicity. He responded by sending guarded letters to both Tywin and Robb, expressing his continued loyalty to whichever outcome solidified first. For the time being, Bolton feigned neutrality. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, Cersei Lannister was incandescent with rage when she heard about her father's negotiations. She confronted Tywin in the Red Keep's council chamber, demanding to know why he would allow the upstart boy from the north to keep any semblance of a crown. Tywin, immovable as stone, informed her that the realm could no longer afford a protracted war, especially after Joffrey's death had destabilized the capital. Tommen was a child king, easily influenced, and the Tyrells, now fully integrated through Margaery's marriage to Tommen, would not keep pouring resources into a war that yielded no spoils. If the North would pay taxes and cease rebellion, Tywin deemed that victory enough. Cersei fumed, but she was powerless against her father's unwavering logic. Tyrion Lannister, for his part, followed the developments from his vantage as Master of Coin, and also as the man wrongly accused of poisoning Joffrey. He privately approved of the notion of peace, if only because it might spare more lives. Tyrion had no love for the savage side of warfare. He had seen enough blood spilled at the Blackwater. But he doubted it would be so simple. The North would never truly trust the Lannisters, and vice versa. Still, if the alternative was endless bloodshed, a precarious peace might be the best they could manage. Beyond the capital, whispers abounded. In the Reach, many of the Tyrell lords balked at the idea of giving the North any measure of independence. What's to stop the Reach from demanding the same? Some asked. But Mace Tyrell and Olenna Tyrell had bigger concerns, primarily fortifying their position at court. In the Westerlands, lesser lords loyal to Casterly Rock muttered that Tywin was ceding too much. Yet none dared question Tywin openly. In the Stormlands, pockets of Baratheon loyalists who had once rallied to Renly looked upon the evolving situation with confusion. Stannis was rumored to be in the north, fighting wildlings or aligning with the Night's Watch. The realm was a tapestry of uncertain threads, all hinging on the question: would Robb Stark and Tywin Lannister truly forge a lasting truce? Back at Riverrun, the days bled into weeks as correspondence flew between the North and King's Landing. Envoys passed through the war-ravaged roads, braving outlaws and broken bridges. Drafts of formal agreements arrived, bristling with legalese penned by Pycelle and the scribes in the Red Keep. Robb's own advisors labored over them in the castle's solar, crossing out lines that seemed too binding, adding clauses that would protect northern interests. He insisted upon language guaranteeing the safe return of Sansa, once found, as well as a promise that the Crown's armies would not march north of the Neck without Stark invitation. Tywin wanted explicit terms that banned the North from raising arms against the crown unless attacked first. It was an intricate dance, neither side willing to yield more ground than necessary. While these negotiations lumbered onward, Jaime Lannister remained a closely watched guest. Robb granted him a private chamber rather than a cell, honoring Tywin's demand for courtesy, but a guard was posted at the door at all hours. Jaime chafed under the scrutiny, pacing the confines of his small quarters. He had few to talk to. Most of the northern men wanted nothing to do with him, and Karstark's men, in particular, glowered at him with unconcealed hatred. On rare occasions, Jaime and Robb exchanged words in the corridor, always under the watchful eye of half a dozen guards. The tension remained palpable. Jaime's presence was a constant reminder of how fragile the potential peace truly was. Catelyn Stark tried to keep her hopes in check, each day scanning for ravens in case one might bear news of Sansa's location. She prayed to the Seven that her girl would be found safe. She prayed for Arya too, though her hopes of finding her wild youngest daughter alive diminished as time wore on. In her darkest hours, Catelyn thought about Ned, about the promise she had made to keep the family together. She felt as though she had failed, but she clung to the last thread of possibility that peace might bring her daughters home. Amid the swirl of negotiations, the north wind grew colder. Autumn leaves turned from gold to brown, littering the roads. The nights lengthened, and rumors came down from the wall that the wildlings were on the move in unprecedented numbers. Some said the dead walked in the far north, though such whispers were dismissed by most lords as superstition. Yet in Winterfell's ruins, a few loyal men who had returned to hold what was left of the castle reported sightings of strange lights on the horizon, unearthly wails carried by the wind. Stories trickled south, rarely believed, but enough to stir unease in those who bothered to listen. Then came a letter sealed with the wax of the veil, a falcon sigil pressed into white. It was from Peter Baelish, Lord Protector of the Vale, or so he now styled himself. In it, Baelish claimed that Sansa Stark was indeed in his custody at the Eyrie, ostensibly for her own protection. The letter was addressed to both Tywin Lannister, in King's Landing, and Robb Stark, in Riverrun. In his flowery style, Baelish wrote, "To my esteemed allies in the north and in King's Landing, I regret that I could not present Lady Sansa sooner, but circumstances required secrecy. I have sheltered her here in the Vale, away from the chaos of the capital, for fear that certain parties would seek to harm her for political advantage. Now that King Tommen's rule is secure under Lord Tywin's guidance and King Robb is prepared to make peace, I propose a meeting at the Bloody Gate to negotiate the safe release of Lady Sansa into her family's protection. Of course, we shall need assurances on both sides that the Vale will be recognized and respected in the new order. Peter Baelish, Lord Protector of the Vale." The letter infuriated Tywin, who saw Baelish as an up-jumped commoner meddling in royal affairs. It also concerned Robb, who knew Baelish had once professed love for Catelyn but was hardly someone to be trusted. Still, the letter confirmed Sansa was alive, which brought Catelyn to tears of relief. If Baelish was telling the truth, Sansa was within reach. But on what terms? Another flurry of ravens soared. Tywin demanded that Baelish deliver Sansa to King's Landing. Baelish politely refused, stating that he would only hand her over if the Vale's neutrality and independence were guaranteed, or at least recognized, by both the Crown and the North. Robb found that condition intriguing. Baelish was effectively holding Sansa as leverage to carve out his own petty kingdom in the Vale. The question was whether Tywin would allow such a thing. For Robb, if the Vale truly remained independent, that might further loosen Lannister power. Yet it also meant the North might lose a potential ally in the future. The Vale was well known for its strategic mountain passes and formidable knights. On the other hand, if the Vale remained neutral, Robb wouldn't have to worry about an army from the area attacking him. He weighed these complexities in the presence of his closest advisors, discussing it deep into the night. In the end, a consensus formed that retrieving Sansa was paramount. If that meant granting some measure of autonomy to the Vale, well, the realm was fracturing anyway, with the Crown in one corner, Stannis in the north, if rumors were true, and the Tyrells holding the Reach. The old order had been badly shaken, Perhaps a realm of semi-autonomous regions was inevitable. Tywin, however, was less sanguine about it. He fired off demands that Baelish present himself in King's Landing for an audience. Baelish, in turn, demurred, insisting that the Vale's lords might be upset if he left Sansa unguarded. The standoff threatened to unravel the entire peace process. If Tywin refused to accept Baelish's terms, Sansa would remain out of reach, and Robb would have no incentive to finalize a treaty. Meanwhile, Baelish had no reason to yield unless both the Crown and the North recognized his domain. It was a tangle of ambitions, with Sansa caught in the middle. Perhaps ironically, it was Catelyn Stark who found a way forward. Remembering Peter Baelish's long-standing fixation on her, she proposed that she and Robb travel to the Bloody Gate to parley with him directly. If Baelish truly cared for her, or at least her memory, he might be more amenable to handing over Sansa if Catelyn herself made the request. Tywin, suspicious, insisted on sending his own representative to observe. It was ultimately agreed that Kevan Lannister would accompany them. Once again, lines of safe conduct were negotiated. The arrangement required that Robb bring only a small retinue, no more than 20 men, and that Baelish would host them in the Vale under the watch of local knights. It was a remarkable event. The king in the north venturing toward the Vale, accompanied not only by his mother and a handful of Northmen, but also by Ser Kevan Lannister and a few crown soldiers. The roads were less war-torn in that eastern direction. The Vale had largely escaped the devastation that ravaged the Riverlands, thanks to Lysa Arryn's isolationist stance. Lysa, however, was now deceased. Rumor said she had perished in a tragic accident, possibly orchestrated by Baelish. As they approached the Bloody Gate, a narrow pass flanked by sheer mountains, Robb could not help but marvel at the natural defenses. A few knights in Arryn livery stood guard, looking uneasy at the sight of Stark and Lannister emblems side by side, but they opened the way under orders from Baelish. The path beyond led upward through cold, stony heights. Snow dusted the crags, and the wind whistled through the peaks. Catelyn drew her cloak tighter, remembering the last time she had come to the Vale, under vastly different circumstances. Eventually, they reached a rocky plateau where a small camp had been pitched. Baelish himself waited, clad in a fine sable cloak, a mockingbird pin at his throat. At his side stood several Vale knights, plus a young boy in rich clothes, Lord Robert Arryn, pale and sickly, but nominally the ruler of the Vale. Sansa was not immediately visible, and Catelyn's heart stuttered with fear. But as they dismounted, Baelish inclined his head with a sly smile. "Lady Stark," he murmured, stepping forward, "and King Robb, how good of you to come." His sharp gray-green eyes flicked to the men behind them, Kevan Lannister in particular. "And you've brought a Lannister? How interesting. I suppose that means you're trying to keep everything quite official, yes? Very well. Welcome to the Vale." Catelyn did not bother with pleasantries. "Where is my daughter?" Baelish sighed theatrically. "Safe, of course, my lady. I would never harm a hair on her head." He motioned behind him, and in that moment, a tent flap parted. Sansa emerged, cheeks pink from the cold, eyes wide with mingled fear and hope. She wore a soft blue cloak with the falcon sigil of House Arryn stitched on the breast, her red-brown hair pinned back. The instant she saw her mother, tears sprang to her eyes. "Mother!" Sansa exclaimed. She rushed forward, nearly stumbling on the uneven ground, and flung herself into Catelyn's arms. Catelyn held her tightly, tears of relief spilling down her cheeks as well. Robb watched, his throat thick with emotion. His sister looked older, no longer the shy, porcelain creature he remembered from Winterfell. She had a haunted cast to her face, a certain fragility born of the horrors she must have witnessed. But here she was in the flesh, alive. Baelish allowed them a moment. Then, clearing his throat delicately, he raised his voice so all could hear. "As you see, I have kept Lady Sansa in comfort and safety, but I cannot release her without certain guarantees for the Vale. Lord Robert Arryn is under my protection and guardianship. We desire to remain free of the conflicts that ravage the realm, and should King Tommen or King Robb or any other attempt to impose outside rule, we would resist. Kevan Lannister stepped forward, trying to maintain a diplomatic expression, though he clearly despised Baelish. Lord Baelish, the crown has no intention of seizing the Vale by force, so long as the Vale does not harbor rebels or traitors. If you recognize King Tommen's rightful rule, Baelish waved a hand. Recognize? That's such a strong term. We prefer to remain neutral, unaligned. We will not wage war against the crown, nor will we hamper the crown's affairs, provided we are left alone. That is the Vale's position. If it cannot be respected, then I fear we cannot release Lady Sansa. She would remain our guest indefinitely, for her own good, you understand. Catelyn stiffened, but Robb spoke before she could. You're holding my sister hostage, he said flatly. Is that what you call your hospitality? Baelish offered him a thin smile. I call it prudence, my lord. Lady Sansa has no desire to see further bloodshed. I only act in the Vale's best interests and in hers. If the crown or the North attacked the Vale, it would place her in grave peril. I'm sure you don't want that. Robb reined in his anger, aware that Kevan Lannister and the Vale Knights were watching every gesture. What do you want, specifically? A document guaranteeing the Vale's neutrality, recognized by both the Iron Throne and the King in the North, along with any others who might claim dominion over these mountains. Baelish bowed in mock modesty. You see, we speak the same language after all. Yes, precisely. Put it in writing, sealed by Tywin Lannister on behalf of Tommen, and by you on behalf of the North. In exchange, I shall surrender Lady Sansa to you, along with assurances that I will do nothing to impede her safe travel. Kevan Lannister suppressed a scowl. He recognized that Baelish was, in effect, forcing them to carve out an independent Vale. Tywin would despise that. But Kevan also knew Tywin wanted Sansa under the crown's influence, if only to finalize the agreement with Robb. The labyrinth of politics grew thicker by the hour. Kevan cleared his throat. I will relay your conditions to Lord Tywin, but I cannot promise he will be pleased. Baelish gave a little shrug, mouth curving in a sly half-smile. In that case, I suppose Lady Sansa will remain with us. Perhaps she will have time to tour the Ares' famed moon door. She might find it quite enlightening. A flash of anger lit Catelyn's eyes. She held Sansa's hand, refusing to let go. We've had enough of your games, Peter, she said, voice taut with fury. My daughter will not be your bargaining chip. If you still claim to love me as you once did, do not stand between me and my child. For a moment, a flicker of genuine emotion crossed Baelish's face. Perhaps he did feel something, twisted devotion or longing. Then it was gone, replaced by calculated poise. I do this to protect her and the Vale, but I will consider letting her visit with you under guarded conditions, if that eases your concern. Robb looked ready to lash out, but Catelyn placed a hand on his arm. They had come too far to turn the Vale into another battlefield. I will remain here in the Vale until the official word from Tywin arrives. If Tywin agrees to these terms, if he signs a binding treaty acknowledging Vale neutrality, then we shall take Sansa home. She turned to Kevan Lannister. Return to your lord and bring us his answer quickly. We will not abide needless delays. Kevan nodded curtly, aware that any sign of hostility might provoke a confrontation neither side desired. I'll leave at once. And so the arrangement was made. Catelyn and a small group of Northmen would stay in the Vale, where Sansa could remain close at hand. Robb, torn between his duty to the north and his desire to protect his sister, decided that Catelyn and Brynden Tully would manage the negotiations in the Vale, while he returned to Riverrun to maintain the broader push for a final peace with Tywin. If Tywin approved the Vale's neutrality, Sansa would be released. If not, Baelish would likely dig in, turning the Vale's formidable defenses into a fortress of refusal. Saying farewell to his mother and sister was one of the hardest moments of Robb's life. Sansa clung to him, tears on her lashes, pleading not to be left behind. Catelyn placed a reassuring hand on her daughter's shoulder. I'll stay with you, my sweet girl. Your brother must see to the rest of our people. Robb embraced them both, giving Sansa a quiet promise. I'll do everything in my power to make sure we bring you home." She nodded, though her gaze flicked nervously to Baelish, who stood a short distance away, quietly conferring with the Vale Knights. Then Robb departed, accompanied by Kevan Lannister's party, forging back down the narrow passes, hearts heavy but minds resolute. If this was the price of retrieving Sansa, so be it. The journey back to Riverrun was uneventful, though the cold seemed sharper, the nights longer. Robb shared a grim camaraderie with Kevan Lannister along the way, for both men knew they were at the mercy of forces greater than themselves. Tywin's calculating genius, Baelish's duplicity, the unstoppable march of winter. They parted with curt nods near the crossroads, Kevan turning south for King's Landing, Robb turning west for Riverrun. Upon arriving at the castle, Robb found a host of new concerns waiting. A letter from Roose Bolton expressed reservations about the proposed peace, hinting that the Dreadfort's resources might not be fully committed if the king in the north was willing to bend the knee, even symbolically. Another letter from Walder Frey pressed for more recognition and threatened to recall his troops if the new arrangement didn't favor the twins. The Blackfish, stoic as ever, greeted his nephew with a litany of smaller crises: bandits in the Riverlands, supply issues for the winter, and the continuing tensions with House Karstark. Most worrying of all, Rickard Karstark had grown ever more sullen, occasionally venting in the yard that Robb was selling out the north for one girl. He wanted Jaime Lannister's head, not a treaty. Robb recognized that if Karstark turned traitor, it could lead to open conflict among the northern lords themselves. He resolved to speak with Lord Karstark personally. That meeting was tense. Robb found Karstark in one of the lesser halls, surrounded by a knot of his own men. They spoke in low voices, quieting when Robb entered. Karstark rose, face set in a rigid mask. "Your Grace," he said, more formality than warmth in his tone. Robb inhaled slowly. "Lord Karstark, I've heard you're displeased with the direction of these negotiations. I wanted to address your concerns directly." Karstark's jaw clenched. "I have buried too many sons, Your Grace. I fight to avenge them, not to sign away the North's pride. Will we bow to the Lannisters after all they've done?" Robb kept his tone level. "No. We're securing terms that give us near-total autonomy, in exchange for an end to a war that's draining us of blood. Winter is coming, and we can't fight on every front forever. We need peace, an honorable peace." Karstark spat on the floor. "Honorable peace? The Lannisters know nothing of honor. They strung up your father and turned your sisters into pawns. Now we treat with them as if they're equals. Give me 1 hour alone with the Kingslayer, and I'll show them what justice really looks like." Robb's eyes hardened. "I cannot allow that. Jaime is our best means of ensuring Sansa's safe return. If you harm him, we lose that leverage and give Tywin reason to break all deals. I understand your pain, but the realm is at stake." For a moment, Karstark looked ready to draw steel. His men stirred, tension thick in the air. Then Karstark exhaled. "Your father took my loyalty for granted, and I gave it. You do the same. But my grief is a heavy burden. Pray that your treaty yields fruit, or you will answer to the Karstarks for the blood spilled." With that veiled threat, Karstark turned on his heel and departed, his men trailing behind him. Robb remained, feeling a deep ache in his chest. The seeds of discord within his own ranks were sprouting. If the peace fell apart, if Sansa was not freed, or if the Lannisters played him false, Karstark could become a dangerous foe from within. Time stretched onward, negotiations swirling through the realm like a great churn. Tywin Lannister, after lengthy debates with his council, wrote to Baelish, grudgingly acknowledging the Vale's neutrality, though he filled the treaty with so many conditions that Baelish was forced to quibble over details. In the Vale, Catelyn watched the back and forth with mounting frustration, all while comforting Sansa and trying to keep Baelish's scheming at bay. Sansa herself was a mixture of relief at being away from King's Landing and anxiety about the uncertain future. She missed her sister, had nightmares about Joffrey's cruelty, and confided to her mother that she simply wanted to go home to Winterfell, even if it lay half in ruins. In King's Landing, Cersei's fury burned. She saw Baelish's demands as an insult and threatened to dispatch soldiers to the Vale to seize Sansa by force. Tywin forbade it, pointing out that the mountain passes of the Vale were too well defended, and that it would mean open war with a region the crown could ill afford to fight. The Tyrells, for their part, were ambivalent. Some wanted Sansa for potential marriage alliances, others found the entire affair tedious. Margaery Tyrell, now Queen to Tommen, had little reason to scorn Sansa, but neither was she eager to champion Sansa's cause. Back at Riverrun, Robb began to draft his final terms with Tywin. As part of the arrangement, Tywin demanded that Jaime be allowed to return to King's Landing under guard, as soon as Sansa was physically in Robb's custody. Each side agreed to exchange hostages to ensure compliance. Tywin also insisted that House Bolton be recognized as co-rulers of the North's eastern territories, a move clearly designed to keep the Starks in check. Robb balked at that, knowing Bolton's treacherous nature. The matter led to furious arguments in the Solar, with the Blackfish nearly storming out at the suggestion. Ultimately, Robb offered a compromise. Bolton could remain in his position at the Dreadfort, but the official title of Warden of the North would be reserved for House Stark. Tywin, for the moment, accepted that, no doubt anticipating that Bolton's ambitions would cause trouble for Robb down the line. And so, piece by piece, a tenuous tapestry of promises was stitched together, each thread threatening to snap at the slightest strain. The final question remained: would Baelish deliver Sansa once Tywin signed the recognition of the Vale's neutrality? If so, Robb would then release Jaime. It was a wobbly chain of contingencies, reminiscent of a line of dominoes that could tumble at a single nudge. The day arrived when word came from the Vale. Peter Baelish agreed to release Sansa to Catelyn's care, provided that the official parchments recognizing Vale neutrality were delivered promptly. Tywin, having no desire to appear the one who torpedoed the entire piece, produced said parchments, though he embedded disclaimers that if the Vale ever harbored enemies of the crown, neutrality would be forfeit. Baelish accepted them with a flourish of thanks. At last, Catelyn wrote to Robb, informing him that she and Sansa would travel under Vale escort to a predetermined location in the Riverlands, midway between the Bloody Gate and Riverrun, where they would be officially welcomed back into the Stark fold. Once that was done, Baelish's knights would depart, and Sansa would be free to continue to Riverrun or even to the north as she wished. It sounded almost too good to be true. Robb felt a cautious thrill of hope, yet the pit in his stomach warned him not to celebrate prematurely. So many snares and hidden knives might lurk on the path. Nevertheless, he assembled a small contingent of loyal men to ride out and meet his mother and sister. They would gather at a riverside clearing that had been deemed neutral territory. The day dawned with a sharp, frosty wind. Robb rode with the Blackfish, Lord Bolton's representative, and a handful of trusted knights. Jaime Lannister remained at Riverrun under guard. They did not intend to release him until Sansa stood safely by Robb's side. The roads were muddy but passable, the skeletal trees swaying overhead. It felt eerily quiet, as if the entire realm held its breath. They reached the designated clearing in the late afternoon. The river's bank was strewn with reeds, the water gliding past in a cold rush. 2 tents stood on opposite sides of the clearing, Vale knights in Arryn livery on one side, Stark men on the other. In the middle, Baelish stood with that signature smirk, overshadowed by the mountainous figure of a Vale knight in full plate. Catelyn and Sansa were there, too, the latter wrapped in a gray cloak. Robb's heart leapt at the sight of them. He dismounted, hurrying forward, gray wind at his heels. Catelyn moved to greet him, relief plain on her face. "Robb," she breathed. "It's done." Peter received the documents from Tywin. "The Vale is neutral, and Sansa is free to go with us." Sansa moved forward tentatively, as though expecting the ground to vanish beneath her feet. "Robb," she whispered, searching his face. "Is it really over?" He took her hands gently. "You're safe now," he said, voice catching in his throat. "We're taking you home." She trembled, tears welling. "I want to see Winterfell again, though I know it's gone. Mother told me it was burned, but it's still home. We'll rebuild it together," he assured her. pulling her close for a warm embrace. Somehow, Baelish's voice intruded smoothly. "What a touching reunion. I'm so pleased it all worked out." Robb turned to glare at him. "You have what you wanted, then? The veil stands apart, and you hold sway there without interference from the crown or the north. Will you release my mother and sister from your manipulations? Or is there another catch?" Baelish placed a hand on his heart in feigned offense. "I assure you, I want only the best for Lady Sansa. I've delivered her as promised. Now, if you'll excuse me, we shall depart for the Vale." Catelyn's gaze locked on Baelish, a mixture of gratitude and bitterness. "Thank you for at least returning my daughter alive. I pray your future in the Vale does not lead you down a dark path, Peter." He flashed that unctuous smile. "My lady, I lead only where my wits guide me. Farewell." With that, he and the Vale Knights withdrew, melting into the treeline, leaving only a faint echo of hoofbeats on the path. Thus, in that unassuming riverside clearing, the Starks finally reunited with their lost daughter, an outcome unimaginable in the timeline overshadowed by the Red Wedding. Here, the Red Wedding had never happened, meaning Walder Frey had not unleashed the butchery that ended Robb's cause in a single bloody night. As a result, the war had dragged on, shifting alliances, forcing awkward compromises. Yet in this swirl of chaos, Sansa was restored to her family. They remained in the clearing a while, letting Sansa gather her composure. She told Robb and Catelyn in hushed fragments about her time in King's Landing, the humiliations, the fear, her forced betrothal to Tyrion, Joffrey's cruelty. Catelyn's fury flared as she listened, but Sansa explained that Tyrion himself had not mistreated her. Indeed, he had tried to protect her at times. Nevertheless, the weight of Joffrey's sadism had pressed on her constantly. She also recounted the day Joffrey died, how she'd fled amid the chaos, whisked away by Ser Dantos at Baelish's behest. Then came her time in the Vale, where Lysa Arryn's erratic behavior and eventual death left her in Baelish's clutches. Now finally she was free. Robb embraced her once more, promising that no harm would come to her in the North's care. They mounted their horses, setting off toward Riverrun under the light of a setting sun. When they arrived, the sight of Sansa caused a stir among the garrison. Men who remembered her from Winterfell or from stories of Lord Eddard gazed at her with sympathy. She'd been the fair maid of House Stark, once betrothed to the Crown Prince, now returned as a survivor of the war's cruelties. Some quietly called her the Rose of Winterfell, though the bloom of her innocence was long gone. Jaime Lannister, hearing of her arrival from his guarded chamber, closed his eyes in relief or resignation. One more step toward his eventual release, though it meant the days of captivity might be ending. In the great hall, a somber meal was prepared. Sansa sat beside Catelyn, her appetite slight. Robb forced himself to eat, though anxiety still churned in his stomach. The final piece of the puzzle was to return Jaime and secure the official peace with the Lannisters. That step would likely cause more unrest among the Northern Lords, especially Karstark. Even so, Robb felt that a corner had been turned. He had rescued Sansa, avoided the slaughter that might have befallen them at the Twins, and kept the North from total destruction. He was not entirely a triumphant conqueror, no one was. Yet House Stark was still alive and, in many ways, stronger than it might have been if the Red Wedding had taken place. The next morning, Robb convened his council in a smaller chamber to announce that Sansa was safely returned. The lords congratulated him, though the Great John clapped him so hard on the back it nearly knocked him forward. Karstark stood to one side, arms folded, his nod of acknowledgement stiff. Robb took a breath and addressed them all. "We have Sansa back. The last part of our arrangement with Tywin Lannister is to release Jaime. I know this pains many of you, especially those who lost kin at Lannister hands. But our cause was always to secure the North's safety and the freedom of our family. We have done that, albeit at great cost. The war need not continue if we can sign a stable peace. Winter is upon us. Let us see to our families, our harvests, and our lands, rather than feed men into the grinder of war." Silence reigned for a moment. Then the Great John bellowed, "Hear him!" A Stark in Winterfell or near enough. I can drink to that. A smattering of agreement followed, though Karstark said nothing, expression like stone. Walder Frey's men, present at the edges, gave each other guarded looks, measuring whether they stood to gain or lose from an end to hostilities. Later that day, Robb met with Jaime in the courtyard. The Kingslayer was escorted by 4 armed guards. As soon as Jaime saw Robb's expression, he guessed the news. "She's here, isn't she? Sansa Stark. That means my time is up." Robb nodded. "You'll be taken south under guard, delivered to your father. Once the final treaty is signed, you'll be free. If Tywin betrays us, or tries to keep the war going, then your life is forfeit. Do you understand?" Jaime let out a humorless chuckle. "Oh, I understand. You don't trust him, and I don't blame you. But I have no desire to see more war either. I've had enough of it." Robb assessed him, looking for any sign of deception. Jaime's eyes were weary, his posture less arrogant than before. Perhaps captivity had changed him, or perhaps it was just an act. Either way, Robb had no choice but to proceed. "Tomorrow at dawn you ride out. I'll pick the men who go with you, mostly those loyal to me above all. If you or your father attempt to harm them, or if you try to escape prematurely, the deal is null." Jaime shrugged. "You might find that living as a peace hostage in King's Landing is no small risk. But that's not my concern, is it?" Robb's tone hardened. "Tread carefully, Kingslayer. I fought too long and lost too many for your flippancy." Jaime lifted his stump in a half-salute. "You have my word, for whatever it's worth." Robb gave a curt nod and walked off. He hated trusting a Lannister. But, ironically, this entire chain of events hinged on just that, trusting that Tywin needed Jaime back so badly that he would keep his word. If the Red Wedding had happened, none of this would be taking place. Instead, the realm would be locked under the Lannisters' grip, with the Starks nearly exterminated. Now, at least there was a chance, fraught, precarious but real, that the bloodshed might end in something resembling an armistice. They set out at dawn, Jaime bound in front on horseback, a small retinue of Northmen surrounding him. Among them was an older soldier named Martin Rivers, a seasoned veteran who had once fought under Ned Stark. He commanded the escort with a calm efficiency. They would ride to a location near the border of the Riverlands and the Crownlands, where Tywin's men would be waiting to sign the official documents. Then, presumably, Jaime would be handed over, and the realm would shift into a new phase of uneasy peace. Robb watched them depart from the gates of Riverrun, Sansa at his side. She shuddered slightly as she saw Jaime vanish over the drawbridge. He didn't hurt me, you know, while I was in King's Landing," she whispered, as though reading Robb's silent thoughts. "He was always away or captured, but he's still a Lannister." Robb placed a hand on her shoulder. "He is. But if it means you're safe, it's worth it." She nodded, pressing her lips together. The rest of the day was marked by a quiet tension. Messengers came and went. Small tasks occupied the lords, but everyone awaited news of the final exchange. Catelyn had returned with Sansa to Riverrun a few days earlier. She spent much of her time praying in the castle sept, seeking the mother's guidance. The Great John drank and boasted of future hunts. Frey men hovered around, angling for more concessions. Karstark's men glowered but remained outwardly obedient. Finally, after 2 days that felt like an eternity, a raven arrived bearing the seal of House Lannister. It carried a single parchment inside. _ King Robb Stark, Ser Jaime Lannister has arrived safely at our camp. The Crown recognizes your rightful governance over the North, with the conditions we have discussed. The realm now stands at peace so long as these conditions are upheld. The enclosed documents confirm the arrangement, signed in the presence of the High Septon. Lord Tywin Lannister, Hand of the King. Attached were copies of the official treaty, stamped and signed by Tywin, Kevin, Pycelle, and even King Tommen's childish scrawl. Robb's heart hammered as he read it. They had effectively recognized the North's autonomy, albeit as a nominal vassal realm. Sansa and Arya, if found, would not be pursued by Lannister agents. In return, the North would refrain from further aggression. The taxes to the crown were set at a modest rate. The lines on the map remained as they were. The Freys and Boltons were each recognized in their seats, though not elevated further. That night, a subdued sense of relief permeated Riverrun. Men drank, albeit warily. They told each other that the bloodshed might finally end. The Great John roared with approval, though some of the more somber lords found little to celebrate. The war had claimed tens of thousands of lives, left the Riverlands in ruins, the North battered, and House Stark struggling to rebuild. Yet the alternative had been far worse. At least Winterfell could be reclaimed, at least Sansa was home, and no more armies would trample the fields, assuming Tywin kept his word. In the days that followed, ravens spread word of the treaty across Westeros. The reaction was mixed. Some lords grumbled that the North had seceded in all but name. Others argued that Tywin had bested Robb, for the king in the North now owed taxes and nominal fealty. Most small folk, exhausted by war, simply rejoiced in the prospect of fewer passing armies. Freedmen returned to scorched fields, hoping to salvage a harvest before the snows. In King's Landing, the mood was uncertain. Tommen's coronation had been overshadowed by the realm's fractures, but at least the fighting with the North was done. The Tyrells, for their part, found advantage in new trade routes that might open up, though they eyed the Vale's neutrality with suspicion. In the North, word of peace was greeted with guarded relief. Lords worried about the upcoming winter. They no longer had to worry about southern armies sacking their holds, but the damage inflicted by the Ironborn and Ramsay's depredations still lingered. At the Dreadfort, Roose Bolton publicly affirmed his loyalty to King Robb, though privately he might have seethed that Tywin's arrangement hadn't granted him greater power. The remains of House Greyjoy still squatted in some northern strongholds, but they were weakening, and with the war over, Robb could finally turn his attention to driving them out if they didn't withdraw on their own. And so, as the first snows began to drift across the battered fields of the Riverlands, a fragile peace settled over Westeros. It was a realm utterly changed by the absence of the Red Wedding. Without that catastrophic betrayal, the conflict had ground on much longer, forced the Lannisters to negotiate rather than annihilate the Starks, and enabled alliances and enmities to weave in complex ways. House Stark, though battered, remained a force in the North. Robb had lost none of his moral authority, even if he was now forced to accept a nominal tie to King Tommen's reign. Sansa, rescued from King's Landing and Baelish's clutches, found her way back to some semblance of safety and began the long process of healing. Catelyn, weary beyond measure, clung to the hope that she might yet find Arya. The Great John, Karstark, and the other northern lords gradually focused on rebuilding and fortifying for the dark winter. The Freys lurked, sullenly hoping for more reward, while the Boltons plotted behind closed doors. In King's Landing, Tywin Lannister maintained his iron grip on the regency for King Tommen, forging a new shape for the realm that accommodated a somewhat independent North and a neutral Vale. Cersei stewed in frustration, feeling her family's absolute dominion slip away. Tyrion remained enmeshed in palace intrigues, fending off charges for Joffrey's murder and trying to navigate the new political landscape. The Tyrells consolidated power in the Reach, biding their time. Dorne watched from afar, nursing its own grievances. Stannis Baratheon, somewhere near the Wall, fought a different war entirely against threats most of the realm ignored. Across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen had no immediate knowledge of the intricacies at play in Westeros. She continued her campaign of liberation in Slaver's Bay, forging an army that might someday cross the sea. Her dragons grew, and word of them spread in whispered rumors. None could predict how her eventual return might reshape the political chessboard. But for now, after so many battles, betrayals, and close calls, the North was not drowned in blood. The twins had not become the site of a monstrous trap. The Starks were not extinguished. Instead, a new chapter opened, defined by precarious treaties and uneasy alliances. Winter crept ever closer with all the portents that phrase entailed. Yet House Stark in this new timeline endured.